What if I told you Europe did not conquer Africa easily? What if I told you African kings defeated European armies in open battle? This is not fiction. This is not exaggeration. This is the history you were never taught. And by the end of this video, you may never look at colonial history the same way again.
The African kings who fought Europe and almost won. For the Unspoken Archives. Before Europe carved Africa with rulers and red ink, before Berlin, before the maps were divided like stolen property, there were kings. Not tribal warlords, not primitive chiefs, kings with armies, kings with strategy, kings who looked Europe in the eye and refused to kneel. This is the story of the African rulers who fought Europe and almost won. And history doesn't talk about how close they came. The myth of easy conquest. We've been told a lie, that Europe walked into Africa and conquered it effortlessly, that African resistance was weak, unorganized, doomed. But the truth, Europe bled in Africa. Europe lost battles. Europe panicked. Some African kings didn't just resist, they humiliated empires. Let's begin. Menelik II, the emperor who broke Italy. Year 1896. Italy, young, ambitious, hungry for colonies, believed Ethiopia would be easy prey. They had rifles, cannons, European confidence. But Ethiopia had something else: unity. Menelik II understood something many African rulers didn't have time to learn. Europe wins when Africa is divided. So he did the unthinkable. He united rival regional leaders. He stockpiled modern weapons. He studied European tactics. And then came the Battle of Adwa. Italian generals were certain of victory. They miscalculated Ethiopian numbers. They underestimated logistics. They assumed superiority. They were wrong. Over 100,000 Ethiopian troops descended on Italian forces, and Italy was crushed. Not defeated, crushed. The victory at Adwa stunned Europe. An African army had defeated a European imperial power in open battle. Let that sink in. While most of Africa was falling, Ethiopia stood. Italy would not forget that humiliation, and decades later, under Benito Mussolini, they would return, seeking revenge. But in 1896, Africa had won. Samori Touré, the strategist who fought France for 16 years. West Africa, late 1800s. France was expanding rapidly across the region, but they met a man who refused to disappear quietly. Samori Touré built the Wasulu Empire from nothing. He didn't just fight, he adapted. When France used superior rifles, he secured firearms through trade. When French forces advanced, he relocated strategically. When towns fell, he rebuilt elsewhere. This wasn't reckless resistance. This was calculated war. For 16 years, Samori fought the French. 16 years. He mastered guerrilla tactics before they became textbooks. He scorched land strategically to deny French supply lines. He refused treaties that meant surrender. France grew frustrated. European newspapers described him as dangerous. To colonizers, that meant effective. Eventually, through betrayal and exhaustion of resources, Samori was captured in 1898. But think about this. France, a global empire, struggled for over a decade against one African ruler. That is not weakness. That is resistance history forgot to celebrate.
Asantewaa, the woman who shamed the British. Now we go to the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. The British demanded the Golden Stool, the sacred symbol of Asante sovereignty. To them, it was a throne. To the Asante, it was the soul of the nation. When male leaders hesitated, a woman stood up. Ya Asantewaa. She looked at her council and said, in essence, if the men will not fight, then we the women will. In 1900, she led the War of the Golden Stool against Britain. Imagine the shock in London. An African queen mother leading troops against the British Empire. The Asante surrounded British forts for months. Supplies ran low. The British were shaken. Eventually, reinforcements arrived. The rebellion was suppressed. But here's what they never erased. Ya Asantewaa proved that resistance had no gender, and Britain learned that conquest would never be peaceful. Cetshwayo, the king who shocked the British Army. Southern Africa, 1879. The British Empire, at its height, believed the Zulu kingdom would fall quickly. They had machine guns, modern formations, imperial arrogance. King Cetshwayo prepared his warriors, and then came Isandlwana. Zulu forces, armed mostly with spears and shields, overwhelmed British troops. Over 1,300 British soldiers were killed. It was one of the worst defeats the British ever suffered against an indigenous force. The world was stunned. How could native warriors defeat imperial troops? Because discipline, strategy, and morale matter. Britain eventually retaliated with overwhelming force, but that single battle shattered the myth of European invincibility. For a moment, the empire trembled. Behanzin, the king who refused to bow to France. King Behanzin of Dahomey faced French invasion in the 1890s. He had an organized military, including the famous Dahomey Amazons. Yes, an elite all-female regiment. France expected submission. Instead, they faced fierce resistance. Behanzin burned his own capital rather than let France claim it. He chose destruction over humiliation. Eventually exiled, he never signed away his dignity. France won territory, but they never won his surrender. The pattern Europe feared. Notice something? These weren't random uprisings. They were organized states, structured armies, diplomatic leaders, strategic thinkers. Europe didn't conquer Africa because Africans were incapable. They conquered because they had industrialized weapon production. They exploited divisions. They used betrayal. They manipulated treaties. They leveraged global resources. But where Africa united, Europe struggled. That is the uncomfortable truth. Why you were never taught this. Colonial education systems needed a narrative. Africa was weak. Europe was superior. Colonization was inevitable. Admitting how close some African kingdoms came to long-term independence would destroy that myth. Imagine if more African states had united like Ethiopia. Imagine if rivalries had been set aside earlier. Imagine if arms supply had been more consistent. History could look very different. Almost won. They almost won. Not because they defeated Europe permanently, but because they proved something powerful. Europe was not unstoppable. Colonialism was not destiny. Resistance was real, and dignity was never surrendered without a fight. Closing, direct to audience. So when someone says Africa was conquered easily, remember Adwa. Remember Isandlwana. Remember the Golden Stool. Remember 16 years of French frustration. Remember the kings. And ask yourself, why don't we hear these stories loudly? If this is your first time here, welcome to the Unspoken Archives, where history speaks louder than propaganda. Subscribe, because the next story, it might change everything you thought you knew.